Xtalks is the industry leader in connecting life science, food, healthcare, and medical device professionals. The Xtalks Life Science Podcast features insightful conversations with industry experts about all things pharma, biotech, and more.
Hello and welcome to the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. I'm Ayesha Rashid, Senior Life Science Journalist at Xtalks.com, and this week I am so happy, so delighted to have a very special guest on our show. We have with us Dr. Laura Williams, who is the Chief Patient Officer at Ardelyx, which is a company developing and commercializing first-in-class medicines for diseases like chronic kidney disease as well as IBS. As an accomplished physician scientist, healthcare policy advisor, patient advocate, portfolio strategist, and board member with nearly 30 years of pharmaceutical experience across all development phases and multiple therapeutic areas in both large pharma and smaller biotech, Dr. Williams has a proven track record in drug development as indicated by her leadership and major contributions toward 8 drug approvals. Prior to Ardelyx, Dr. Williams served as Senior Vice President and Head of Clinical Development and Biostatistics at AMAG Pharmaceuticals, where she was responsible for 4 investigational staged assets and 2 on-market compounds. Prior to AMAG, Dr. Williams served as Vice President of Clinical Development at Myovant Sciences, and prior to that, Dr. Williams had an 18-year career at Abbott AbbVie, where she held roles of increasing responsibility, leading multiple global clinical development programs and managing the general medicine therapeutic areas. Dr. Williams earned her Bachelor of Science degree from Mississippi State University, a Doctor of Medicine degree from the University of Iowa, as well as a Master of Public Health degree in epidemiology from the University of Washington, where she also completed a clinical fellowship in infectious diseases. Dr. Williams completed her internal medicine residency at University of Michigan, where she also served as chief resident and junior faculty. So to learn more about the drug discovery work that Dr. Williams is now spearheading at Ardelyx, let's turn to her now. Dr. Williams, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Ayesha, it's a pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm so honored.
Oh, no, the honor and pleasure is absolutely mine. Just learning more about your background, and I'm so excited to be speaking to you about really exciting work that you're leading and to learn more about your background and really this important role, as I was mentioning to you before we went live on air here, of Chief Patient Officer, and how I think you are one of the perfect people to be leading a role like this and really pioneering such an important space. And so thank you so much for your time to share your insights and your journey to this today with us.
Absolutely.
And so, as I mentioned, you've had a remarkable career spanning clinical medicine, public health, and biopharma. And so, just to take a step back, could you share with us, how did your journey from practicing physician to pharma executive really lead to your passion for the work that you are currently leading now as Chief Patient Officer in the realm of patient advocacy and really patient centricity, which we hear a lot about, but really you're putting that into practice?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question, Ayesha. I think, when I look at my career, a lot of what has transpired to get me to where I am now with this, sort of passion, if you will, for patient advocacy really started during my infectious diseases fellowship at the University of Washington. It was at the height of the HIV epidemic, and during my first year as a fellow, we only had one drug, and it was AZT. And so this was basically a universally fatal disease. By the time I was a third-year fellow, we were able to actually get other drugs for experimental use, like protease inhibitors. And long story short, I had a patient who I had admitted to hospice because he was in dire straits, right? And it just looked dismal. But I decided to try, one of these innovative new therapies. And he got so much better that they actually kicked him out of hospice.
Wow.
And I had to help him find an apartment. And so for me, that was truly my penicillin moment because I had never seen, at least in my lifetime, a disease that was universally fatal to become, something that you could manage on a chronic basis. So it was truly transformational for me. And I think that's what got me started. And I think, you know, subsequent to that, one of the mantras that I have that was passed down to me from one of my mentors is that the patients are waiting. And I felt that way, both literally and figuratively with that experience. So I think this passion has to begin from a position of empathy, a genuine concern, for others.
That sets the stage so beautifully and so wonderfully. I mean, thank you so much for sharing that story in terms of really, it begins with the patient, right? And I love that the patients are waiting. So that's wonderful that you were able to make such a difference in that particular patient's life from treatment and seeing that patient as a person. I think that really, it's simplistic, but really putting that into practice does take a lot. And Dr. Williams, I know that you have an even more personal experience as a physician dealing with health challenges, and all of us deal with health challenges from time, within our lifetime, whether ourselves personally or our loved ones, family, friends. And so if you wouldn't mind sharing what has been your personal experience as a physician and as a patient as well, and how has that shaped your view of the patient experience? And ultimately, how does that influence your approach in drug development and access today? We've already heard about that really empathetic perspective and nature that you have towards others, but then how has your personal experience added to that?
I've always felt like I've been an advocate for patients as a physician, as a practicing physician in the early days. I always wanted to make sure that, I was giving it my best shot in terms of, taking care of patients, making sure that, we could have shared decision making and actually get to desirable outcomes. I think for me, when I experienced my own situation as a patient myself, that was truly eye opening because it was a dire sort of healthcare scare, and I found myself actually here in Boston, some of the best hospitals in the world, having to navigate the healthcare system, and it was just decidedly challenging. And I had to self-advocate for myself, and so I think that experience in and of itself really brought it home. It made it real for me. It starts and ends with the patient, and nothing really outweighs that lived experience. And I think so for me, I know what I needed to do in terms of advocating for patients or advocating for myself. Um, and it made me think, well, if I have to do this as a physician and I understand, the jargon, the language, the things to ask, what does the average patient actually have to go through? And so it just made me even more empathetic in terms of how we deal with patients, how we explain things, how we, listen to hear and not to respond. It was just an eye opener for me, and I think that definitely played a role in terms of my initial role here at Ardelyx. When I joined, I actually started out heading up the patient advocacy group, and it's now full circle as I'm going back toward that area.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that as well, because it's not always easy to share, personal stories like that. So we do appreciate that so much. And, speaking about how you came to Ardelyx, and really I'd love to learn more about The role of chief patient officer. So this is really, truly, I think, a pioneering role, a almost revolutionary role. And so what can you tell us about what a chief patient officer, what does the role entail, and how did that come about? And how did it come about specifically at a place like Ardelyx? And what does that really entail from a patient advocacy and patient centricity perspective, and why is it so important to have today?
All great questions. And I will start with the fact that I think Ardelyx has always centered its most strategic decisions around the patient. And the creation of this chief patient officer role, I think further highlights the commitment that we have for and to our patients. I think it really it embodies an effort or an attempt to amplify the voice of the patient and to ensure that patient-centric approach is weaved into the actual fabric of the organization. And I know people use that term quite a bit, patient-centric, and it's almost, bumper sticker in quality. But at the end of the day, I think when you look at the day-to-day, sort of operations, what are you trying to do? I think first and foremost, you're putting the patient truly first. You are actually listening and understanding their stories. You know the patient journey, and the patient journey is where you start, and once you understand the patient journey, you can then determine where you need to intervene. And you make those decisions as shared decisions, excuse me, with patients, because you know, we can come up with all sorts of innovative things, but if in the end, they don't actually make a difference for patients, they don't change their outcomes, then we failed. And the only way we can ensure that those things happen is that we actually talk to, listen to, understand the preferences, the needs, and the values of the patients that we aim to serve.
Mm-hmm. And how do all of those insights then translate, or how are those incorporated then into the drug development side of things, clinical strategy, and then outcomes? How does that all come full circle, and how is that integrated in that? How is the patient journey integrated within the drug development life cycle?
Yeah, no, again, great questions. I think at the end of the day, by understanding the patient journey, you start to know what questions to ask, right? And I'll give you some examples. What are the characteristics of the disease or the condition that the patient is facing? What about their disease or condition bothers them the most? How does it impact their quality of life? And how does it impact their caregivers? How long does it take for them to get diagnosed with whatever the issue is? And what are the available treatments? Are the treatments, you know, actually making them better? Are they satisfied with their treatments? And is there a need for additional treatments? So I think when you understand the patient journey, then you know where to intervene. If we understand that journey, we actually listen to the patients, we can then employ all of those tactics in every aspect of what we do. So starting from the drug discovery piece, we start to think about, well, what is the issue? What is the problem? That helps us determine, like, where are we going to go to sort of target a specific disease, and what kind of sort of innovation will it be? Will it be a pill? Will it be an injectable? Those sorts of things. You have to know the patient demographics. Who's actually being affected? Is it age specific? Is it race, gender specific? And you only know those things by A, talking to the patients, B, knowing their journey, C, understanding the demographics. And once you know those things, I think you have to be intentional in your efforts to actually innovate on behalf of the patient. So when I say intentional, what do I mean? I think when you are, trying to understand whether or not the intervention that you're, thinking about actually works, is safe and effective, you've got to actually study it in the patients who have the disease.
Right.
And so from a clinical trial standpoint, recruitment, you've got to be intentional in actually recruiting the people that actually reflect, the condition that you're trying to improve.
Yep, indeed. And I think that really puts into perspective, it's by keeping the patient at the center of everything that you're doing, essentially is for the patient. And so it's important to keep them at the center of that drug development life cycle and journey as well. It seems like a no-brainer, but really to implement that in practice has been so challenging. And I think up until now, we've been seeing patients, kind of really detached from that process. They're kind of like at the end, sort of used to be an afterthought. But it's really heartening to see that, things like patient centricity being really put into effect in practice as the way you are pioneering and leading in this role as chief patient officer. And so how does it differ from, because you've served as chief medical officer as well. And so how has that transition been into this new role?
Well, I think every sort of skill set that I've, attained over the years really lead to this moment, right? And so I think the chief medical officer role, in that role, I was overseeing the day-to-day operations of other functions like clinical development, medical affairs, regulatory, pharmacovigilance, those sorts of things. And now I can focus my attention solely on this new chief patient officer role where I'm intently looking for ways to better or more fully represent the patient. And I think, when we look at the chief patient officer role itself, it's relatively new. I mean, I think we've all had an understanding of what, patient centricity means. But it was only 2017 when we actually got a formal sort of definition, if you will, of what
Okay.
patient centricity means. And,
Yeah.
and that definition, and I'll read it to you, it says, putting the patient first in an open and sustained engagement of the patient to respectfully and compassionately achieve the best experience and outcome for that person and their family. That was the formal definition in 2017. But I think simply put, it is amplifying the voice of the patient. It's actually listening to their stories. I go through it in the chief medical officer role. I evaluate reams of data. We've done clinical trials. You look at the data, you interpret the data, you try to, make sense of it to say, gosh, is this drug safe? Is it effective? But when I listen to these stories, that is actually data with a soul. And so that is part of the difference. It's now I will say in this new role, my job is to make sure that everybody understands what it means to be patient-centric. And so rather than using that definition, I'm actually working cross-functionally to have our own internal folks, along with the patients that sit on our advisory council, help us define what patient centricity means. And so we will do that, and I think that will really be important because at the end of the day, as I said before, it starts and ends with empathy, and I want to operationalize empathy across the entire organization.
That is indeed the place to begin. That's wonderful. And thank you so much. I had no idea that the term patient centricity was actually coined just 2017, 2018, as you said.
Yeah, I mean, people have had
An idea.
Is known, right?
Yeah.
What putting patients first actually means, but a formal definition wasn't defined and published until 2017.
And then the actual role of a chief patient officer, when did that come about?
Yeah, that's more recent.
Yeah.
I think the role of the patient in intervention development has been understood for quite some time, and I think although this CPO role is relatively new, it's been gaining a lot of momentum, and I think it'll continue to evolve and expand across the biotech, pharma, space in the future. And I think companies who move in this direction actually show an even greater awareness of the important role that the patient plays. It signals that we truly are placing patients at the core of our strategic decisions. And I'll just say this, simply put, it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Full stop.
Full stop. I love that. And how do you define success in this role, particularly when it comes to aligning, corporate goals with patient-centered outcomes? So how do you strike that balance, and what is success in this role and in this area?
Yeah, I mean, when I look at my, sort of key priorities, I'd probably put them in three buckets. I want to elevate the perspective of the patient within Ardelyx, right? And I want to do that because I think that will dictate the current and future healthcare offerings that we can incorporate in our programs. Two, I want to create a sustainable infrastructure and a platform that actually demonstrates the value of the patient input. Because I think once we do that, when we have a repository of all these powerful patient stories, it can't help but motivate you to continue to innovate, right? And then I think the third piece is just making sure that when we have to make these critical business decisions, that they are always viewed through the lens of the patient. And so the fact that there is this chief patient officer role that reports directly into the CEO guarantees that through me, patients actually have a seat at the table, and that we can actually, direct our decisions from a business perspective to what is best for patients. And I think if we can achieve those tasks, then that becomes that sort of helps to define what success looks like. When I am able to get to a point where people are seeking me out with their stories, and we are incorporating, those messages in our clinical trials, in our, patient assistance programs, and all of those things, then I think we know that we're on the right path. And it's an iterative process. You have to continue to engage. I mean, we have patient advisory councils for all of the therapeutic areas that we are a part of, and that's important. Any function can actually, sort of engage those patients to sort of ask the important questions, and they're willing. They want to tell their stories because they know that this is how innovation happens.
Really informing that process. Patients are integral to that, so it's. And I just wanted to go back to really your leadership roles in both large pharmaceutical companies and smaller biotechs as well. And so, what key lessons have you learned from those environments when it comes to championing patient needs?
Yeah, I think the most important piece is to never underestimate the power of the patient's voice. Whether it's big pharma or smaller biotech, the patient voice should be your North Star. I'm reminded again back in the height of the AIDS epidemic, groups like ACT UP in 1987 and 1988, and how they were able to impact change. So 1987, ACT UP was formalized, and then in 1988, they actually went to the FDA. They made a human chain, and they demanded that not take such a long time to actually come up with these innovative therapies. And because of that, a lot of our policies changed within the FDA, and that was important. I'm also reminded, so that's on a larger scale, and again, when I think about some of the institutions that played an integral role in helping to get us beyond that epidemic, those were a lot of large pharma sort of companies coming up with, again, innovative therapies. But on the smaller biotech side, I'm actually reminded of my own experience here at Ardelyx. I mean, we had developed we had first of all discovered in-house, developed an asset for patients with chronic kidney disease, and we felt great about this innovative product, and we found ourselves though having to sort of really tell our story differently, and so we had an advisory committee meeting with the FDA, and what was so important there is like we went through so much data and just again trying to inform the panel that this was a safe and effective, therapy. But there's a part of that meeting that's called the open public forum, and that's where patients actually come forth and they tell their stories. So there was about 20 patients who like just said, we need this, we need more, we need innovation, we need, you know, it's important. There shouldn't just be one, class of therapy. And that was really impactful for that meeting. And so I think wherever you are, whether it's, big pharma, large, smaller biotech, never underestimate the power of the patient's voice. It 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 is very important, and it is really what should be our North Star. When we are developing clinical trials, we need to have, outcomes that actually matter to the patients, And so I think that would be my advice.
That is wonderfully sound advice indeed. And in terms of whether it's large pharma or smaller biotech, what do you think really sets apart companies that are truly patient-centric? And again, not just to check off a generic box of patient centricity or anything like that, but what really makes a difference, and how are companies set apart that really take into account patient centricity by implementing programs and strategies that really speak and involve the patient voice?
Yeah, I think, it probably is related to the level of trust and transparency that the patient community instills in you. So you can actually determine what kind of company you are based on the amount of trust and transparency that you have with the patient community and their willingness to engage. I mean, the fact that we have patients who want to sit on our patient advisory council. The fact that we are committed to trying to make sure that patients who need our drugs and are prescribed our drugs actually have access to our drugs independent of, their financial status is really important. And so I think inherently people understand and they can identify genuine concern, sincerity, and empathy. And you can't camouflage those qualities. And so, um, to me, what sets, apart those companies is how the community views you, how the patient advocacy groups view you, how you interact with them. All of those sorts of things, I think, are really sort of signs and symptoms, if you will, of what patient centricity looks like.
Indeed, I think when you employ the right strategies and come from the right place, that shows, and so that absolutely. And in terms of the role of the chief patient officer, really evolving across the industry, where do you see it headed over the next couple of years, the next decade, and then also tying into that? What future innovations or models of care are you most excited about when it comes to improving the patient experience in drug development and healthcare delivery? Those are our two questions, but so we'll take the first one in terms of just the role of the chief patient officer evolving in the next couple of years and where you see that heading.
Yeah, as I said before, the CPO role, the chief patient officer role, although it's relatively new, it is gaining momentum, and you see that now in a number of companies who are sort of creating that role, and I think it'll continue to evolve and expand in the future. I think that companies who move in this direction, they show an even greater awareness of why you start and end with the patient, right? And so I see that, I see an evolution in this role that only continues to benefit patients. And I think when you speak to sort of what sorts of future innovations and models, I, I, for me, I go back to the patient journey and innovations that improve time to diagnosis. I mean, we have certain diseases and conditions that patients suffer through for long periods of time before they're actually even diagnosed. And you find that once they get the diagnosis, that in and of itself is a relief, because really now I at least know what I got, right? And if I know what ails me, right, I can start to figure out how to fix it. And so I think innovations that improve time to diagnosis is important. I think provisions for enhanced access to clinical trials is important. Um, you know, Concepts and adaptations that really engender trust for clinical trial participants, um, education on diseases, on treatment options, on access to care. I think all of those things are absolutely critical in terms of future innovations, and again continuing to advance what we're trying to do for patients.
And from a healthcare provider perspective, other life sciences professionals, industry, across academia as well, what would be your advice, having spent, a very illustrious career and having so much expertise and insights, and in this role now as Chief Patient Officer, what advice do you have for industry providers and healthcare providers alike who really want to more meaningfully incorporate the patient voice into their work?
Yeah, I would say start early and often, right? I mean, again, it begins and ends with the patient. And so start early and often with your conversations with patients, right? Because I think the more conversations and the more conversations you have, the more stories you get from these patients, the more you understand their journey, the more equipped you will be to help intervene at the right time. And so when we do that in reverse, when we just go out and try to innovate without the requisite input from patients, we often get it wrong. And so it's important to start with the patient and carry that through all the way through the finish. And so I would say again, don't underestimate the power and the utility of the patient's voice. And their stories are so very powerful. I'll give you, sort of, well, there are tons of examples, but I'll give you one example. As part of my chief medical officer responsibility, I was looking through some safety data, because once a drug is approved, you still have to look at the safety of that drug to make sure that the benefit risk continue to be acceptable. And so I was looking at one report, and it described an adverse event, that a patient had. And it turns out this was one of our chronic kidney disease patients, one of our end-stage kidney disease patients, a patient who had kidney failure. And the adverse event was actually renal transplant. So that patient actually got a kidney transplant as a result of getting control of one of the complications that he had related to his kidney failure while on our drug. So our drug actually made that complication better, got him eligible for transplant, and subsequently he received a transplant. So I think, again, never underestimate the power of the patient's voice. Never underestimate what they, glean in terms of what the needs are. And so one of the things that we hear in that patient population is we need new medications to help, sort of manage this issue. And so I think that's really, really important.
And then from the patient perspective, from the patient side, What kind of advice would you have for patients or patient advocates, caregivers who really want to more meaningfully engage with biopharma, with pharmaceutical companies, with biotech, whether it's industry, whether it's also academia as well, but they don't know where to start. So, what advice would you have for them, for patients looking to get more involved in the process, in the drug development process?
Yeah, I would say to first and foremost try to identify the company of interest, the company that is, sort of working on or working in an area that impacts you, like your particular condition, your disease, your disorder. And I think if you find, that biopharma company that then you just access their website, go and most of those websites actually have a patient page where you as a patient can go to that page. You can click on the contact us button, right? And you can automatically be, sort of shifted to sort of those resources. I think the other thing too is to understand the advocacy groups that are out there that again are related to, the condition that you're most interested in, because that way you don't have to recreate the wheel. Excuse me. There are a number of advocacy groups that have a lot of resources, educational resources, all of those things. And so I think um, just doing the research, asking questions, be curious and intentional about the outcome that you are trying to achieve.
Couldn't get any better advice than that, and couldn't get it from any better of a person, professional, individual than yourself, Dr. Williams. I'd like to thank you once again so much for your time, for being on our show today. It was an absolute pleasure. I've learned so much, and I'm sure our audiences are going to also gain some very valuable, wonderful insights from this conversation. So thank you once again for being on our show and for everything that you do and are pioneering in this very important space and field. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ayesha. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
That's the end of this episode of the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. If you liked today's show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Thank you, everyone, and we will see you next time. Bye for now.
To join the Xtalks community, visit xtalks.com and register for exclusive access to curated content like live webinars, news articles, and educational videos. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speakers sharing them and should not be taken as professional advice, nor do they necessarily reflect the policy or position of Honeycomb Worldwide. For further information, email us at podcast@xtalks.com.